Okay, so Sean, I want you to answer me honestly. Is biased thinking to be avoided?
So I don't think, it depends on what you mean by bias. So I'll try to use an example of how I'm biased, right? So
Sure.
I am biased in that I prefer to play guitar almost doing anything else in my entire life.
Right.
Almost more than eating and sleeping sometimes.
Okay.
I've actually gone all day despite being hungry. So that is a bias. There's also been times where I selectively choose to be biased towards eating over doing other things.
Good
Sometimes
point.
I'll stress eat. So I think that depending on how you look at it, bias itself is actually just the mechanism that determines how we make any decisions, which is basically how we live.
Mm-hmm.
So I actually think it's impossible to not have bias, but I think it is possible to use bias is almost rooted in a different part of the brain than like where objective reality is perceived and rationalized and thought about in a logos context. I think you can be aware of your biases and therefore you can actually bypass them in your decision making.
Okay.
But your bias is like an instinctual mode of operation.
Okay, so how about let me expand with a more specific question then. Maybe that'll help move us along.
Okay.
That might have been too open-ended. So do you think scientific thinking can be biased?
Well, I actually know it is. I mean, in most psychological studies that are done these days, 97% of the studies published prove the hypothesis that they set out to test.
Interesting.
And that's just psychology to keep in mind, which I think is a little bit hard. It's more of a softer science. It's kind of in that bridge between philosophy and the harder sciences, you know?
Right.
It's still valid, but I do think that there's a certain proclivity to call certain things science as a way of giving it credibility when maybe the scientific method isn't as strenuously applied as, say, computer coding, biological engineering, mechanical engineering. You know, it's a carburetor is a carburetor, and you know, an organic compound is not an inorganic compound. You can't flub that kind of stuff. So those kinds of sciences use objective-based facts and variables that are agreed upon within the community to communicate just in general about what it is they're trying to prove. But I want to flip it back over to you.
Go ahead.
Do you think that there's bias, that science can be biased? Not that there is bias in science, but do you think science can be biased?
I agree that it can be, and that's one of the things I want to dig into here.
Okay. So what I have a question for you. What prompted you to think about that question? What were you observing that kind of caused you to form this question or even a hypothesis?
Can I defer that until a little bit later?
Oh, absolutely.
Because I actually have a thought experiment I want to get into just a little bit after this that will kind of help elaborate on that.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, so there's one more question I want to ask you that will fully get us set up for what we want to talk about here. Okay, so do you think truth or knowledge can be defined or is defined by the majority of what people think or agree on?
Oh, that I do not think it relies upon it exclusively. There is some merit to the idea that, I'm going to make up a statistic, but that 99.9% of people have two eyes, they have a nose, they have taste buds, they have ears, and you know, they have skin that's full of, you know, touch receptors, and they can feel pain.
Right.
So 99.9% of all human beings are getting, if not the same information, at least close enough information that we all have consensus about what it is that we're seeing and what it is that we're noticing.
Mm-hmm.
However, I do think that there is some sort of innate human proclivity, and to tie it into our last podcast, you know, where dogma comes in, I think there is a proclivity to try to manipulate other people into believing a certain thing that benefits certain individuals or certain groups more than others. I do think that power is even though postmodernists talk about it a lot, and I don't want to go down that road too much.
Sure.
Power is a dynamic in human existence that I think is a confounding variable in truth.
Mm-hmm.
However, I mean, there is the fact that it doesn't matter how much truth you're speaking. If somebody has the power to silence you, regardless of whether what you're saying is true or not, the person who's powerful, maybe it be physically or they're socially or they have connections or technocratically they're powerful,
right?
They can, it doesn't matter what the truth is almost at that point, which is kind of unfortunate.
Agree.